Your body knows you're in danger long before your mind can find a reason why. In the concrete canyons of the modern metropolis, where glass and steel pierce the clouds, the air does not simply move like the wind across an open field. It pushes. It oscillates at a frequency the human ear cannot register, but the human amygdala, the brain's ancient center for fear, recognizes instantly. This is the weight of a phantom pressure, a silent agitation that transforms the very architecture of progress into an instrument of primal dread. It is a fundamental conflict between our ancient biology and our modern ambition. A danger hidden within the oxygen we breathe, vibrating at a level that bypasses the senses to strike directly at the marrow. In the heart of the city, the monoliths built to dominate the horizon have unintentionally become massive, invisible harps. As the wind shears off the sharp edges of 60-story towers and whistles through the narrow gaps of the financial district, it generates a deep-seated resonance. These are waves of energy surging below 20 Hz, a threshold known as infrasound. While these waves remain below the level of conscious hearing, they are powerful enough to synchronize with the internal organs of living creatures. This subsonic agitation is linked to the sensation of being watched, the sudden chill down the spine, and at certain intensities, a total collapse of the rational mind. We are living inside a giant machine, humming a tune our species was never meant to survive. The first signs that the city had become a sensory trap did not appear in the hospital wards or the police reports. They appeared in the sky. Birds, whose navigation systems are finely tuned to the Earth's natural magnetic fields, were the first to surrender to the invisible hammer. On a Tuesday afternoon, thousands of starlings suddenly broke their graceful formation over the central plaza, diving into the pavement with a ferocity that suggested they were trying to escape their own skin. It was not a mass suicide. It was a desperate flight from a space that had become uninhabitable. Pigeons, usually indifferent to the chaos of human traffic, began to engage in frantic, aggressive behavior on the high ledges. There was no lack of food, and no toxins were found in their systems. There was only the unseen shudder, a constant rhythmic pounding of heavy air shattering their primal instincts. As the weather pattern shifted into a seasonal gale, the silent plague intensified. Below the streets, in the dark labyrinth of the sewer systems and subway tunnels, a secondary migration began. Millions of rodents began to pour out into the light of day, not searching for food, but fleeing the ground itself. The kinetic energy from the foundations of the tallest buildings was being funneled into the earth, turning the quiet soil into a shuddering mass of energy. People watched in confusion as tides of gray fur surged over the sidewalks, the creatures chattering in a high-pitched panic that mirrored the soundless roar occurring above their heads. The vibration had reached the bedrock, and the animals knew what the humans had yet to realize. The environment had turned hostile. This subterranean exodus was merely the beginning of the biological breakdown. For coastal cities, the phantom pressure did not stop at the shoreline. The massive steel pilings anchoring skyscrapers into the shelf acted as tuning forks, transmitting the invisible pulse deep into the ocean floor. Marine life, sensitive to the slightest pressure changes, found their world transformed into a chaotic echo chamber. Schools of fish were found washed up in perfect, unblemished rows, their internal systems disrupted by the relentless thumping of the city's heart. Even the giants of the deep, the whales and dolphins that rely on sound to navigate the darkness, were seen surfacing in the harbors, disoriented and screaming. They were crashing into harbor walls and beaching themselves on concrete piers, driven to an end by a force they could not outswim. Consider Nathan, a software architect living on the 42nd floor of a glass needle in the city's core. Nathan lived by logic, understanding the intricate systems of code and the stability of modern structures. But for weeks, his logic had been failing him. He had not slept more than 2 hours at a time. It was not noise that kept him awake, it was the heavy air. He described it as a physical weight pressing against his chest, a sensation that his high-tech apartment was slowly shrinking. the glass walls inching closer with every breath. His hands, usually steady enough to map out complex data structures, now trembled whenever he sat at his desk. He would stare at the lines of code on his monitor, but the letters seemed to dance to a rhythm he could feel in his teeth. His dog, a once docile golden retriever named Leo, had become a stranger. Leo no longer wagged his tail at the sound of the elevator or the jingle of keys. Instead, he spent his days pressed into the furthest corner of the kitchen, his fur standing on end, growling at the empty floor. The dog was not reacting to a ghost. He was reacting to the tectonic anxiety radiating through the building's steel skeleton. Nathan would watch Leo and feel a mirroring panic. He began to realize that the very towers he admired, the ones he had spent his career helping to optimize, were the source of this unseen torment. The glass and steel were not protecting him. They were focusing the world's energy into a beam directed at his nervous system. The tension in the streets was becoming a tightly coiled spring. People walked with their heads down, their hands over their ears, even though there was nothing audible to block out. The conflict was not between ideologies. It was a conflict between the biology of the human animal and the environment it had built for itself. The skyscrapers now looked like jagged teeth against a darkening sky. Every time the wind picked up, the bone-deep thrum began again, a soundless roar that made the teeth ache and the stomach churn. The city was no longer a place of commerce, it was a resonance chamber of madness. Nathan found himself checking the weather apps every hour, dreading the sight of a high-pressure system or a sudden gust. He began to map out the quiet zones of the city, only to find that they were disappearing as more towers rose to meet the wind. By the second week of the high winds, the reports of animal aggression escalated into a public health crisis. It was not hunger. It was a sensory overload manifesting as unfiltered violence. Stray dogs hunted in packs through the subway tunnels, seemingly driven to silence anything that moved. In the zoos, the apex predators were found curled in the corners of their enclosures, their eyes wide and bloodshot, or else they paced until their paws bled, driven to the brink by the city's structural tremor. Even the hawks and falcons that usually patrolled the high ledges began to dive-bomb pedestrians, their talons extended in a frantic attempt to strike at the source of the invisible agitation. It was as if the entire biological world was trying to claw its way out of a vibrating box. For the human inhabitants, the experience was more insidious. It did not start with violence. It started with the gray fog. This was a psychological state where the boundary between reality and hallucination began to blur. Acoustic energy at 18.9 Hertz can cause the human eyeball to oscillate in its socket, leading to peripheral visions of shadow people, dark shapes that seem to flit just out of sight. The city's population was living in constant, low-level terror, their brains struggling to interpret the danger signal the wind was broadcasting. Sleep became an impossible luxury. The phantom pressure would pulse through the pillows and bed frames, keeping the heart rate elevated and cortisol levels peaking until the mind simply frayed at the edges. Nathan began to see the shadow people on the 14th day. At first, it was just a smudge in the corner of his eye while he brushed his teeth. He turned, and it was gone. Then, it was a tall, dark figure standing by the floor-to-ceiling window of his office, silhouetted against the smoggy horizon. He knew it was not real, but his body did not care. His pulse would skyrocket, his palms would sweat, and a cold dread would wash over him. He found himself avoiding his own apartment, wandering the streets until dawn, only to find thousands of others doing the same. They were all looking for silence, but in the city of towers, silence had become an extinct resource. Every alleyway was a wind tunnel, every plaza a focus for the subsonic weight. One evening, as a massive storm front moved in from the coast, the kinetic energy levels reached a peak that had never been recorded. The wind tunnels between the central plazas acted as amplifiers, focusing the force into concentrated beams. On the street level, the effects were instantaneous. A routine traffic jam turned into a scene of absolute chaos. It did not start with a crash. It started with a driver stepping out of his car and screaming at the sky, his hands clawing at his own chest as if trying to rip out a heart that was beating out of sync with the world. Within minutes, the primal panic had spread. People were abandoning their vehicles, fleeing from a threat they could not name, while others turned on each other with a desperate, frantic violence. The animal kingdom responded in kind. From the shadows of the alleyways, feral cats and stray dogs emerged, not as scavengers, but as participants in the panic. There were reports of birds descending into the crowds, their wings beating against the glass of shop windows until they shattered. It was a symphony of biological failure. The city had become a pressure cooker, and the silent frequency was the heat. There was no logic to the attacks, no reason to the fear. It was simply the sound of survival, stripped of its purpose and turned inward. The very hierarchy of the city's ecosystem had collapsed into a singular goal: to stop the shivering of the air at any cost. Authorities struggled to find a cause. Some suggested a viral outbreak, while others pointed to the possibility of a chemical leak. But those who understood the physics of the city saw the truth in the waves. They looked at the barometers and sensors and saw the reality. The city was pulsating at a rate that human systems could not sustain. The buildings themselves were singing a song of extinction, and as long as the wind blew through those steel and glass canyons, the pressure would continue. It was a structural flaw in the dream of the modern world, a realization that we have built environments our ancient brains simply cannot survive. The infrastructure was working perfectly, yet its very perfection was the catalyst for the breakdown. As the night wore on, the city fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The kind of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of a crushing weight. The violence subsided not because the cause was gone, but because the inhabitants were exhausted, their nervous systems frayed to the point of collapse. They sat in the dark, in their high-rise apartments and their basement shelters, listening to the walls. They could feel the building swaying, a slow, rhythmic movement that sent a pulse through the floor. It was a reminder that the pressure was still there, invisible and untouchable, woven into the very fabric of the city. Nathan sat on his floor, clutching Leo, both of them vibrating in time with the 42nd story of the tower. The gray fog did not lift, it deepened. Within the high-rises, people began to experience a distortion of space itself. The hallways seemed longer, the ceilings lower. In the dim light of flickering emergency bulbs, the walls appeared to be breathing, expanding and contracting with the rhythm of the wind outside. Some residents reported seeing their own furniture shift, moved by the force of the unseen tremor. In one apartment complex, a group of neighbors was found in the lobby, standing in a circle, their eyes closed, humming in perfect unison with the building. It was not a prayer, it was an involuntary mimicry, a desperate attempt by the body to harmonize with the force that was tearing it apart. Even their pets had joined the circle, dogs and cats sitting in a state of catatonic stillness, their breathing synchronized with the sway of the steel. Nathan was among them. He had descended from the 42nd floor, unable to bear the isolation of his shuddering room. He stood in the lobby, his hands hanging limp at his sides, feeling the deep throb of the earth meeting the oscillation of the tower. He no longer felt like an individual. He felt like a cell in a larger, dying organism. The shadow people were no longer in his periphery. They were everywhere, merging with the real people in the room until he could not tell the difference. He looked at Leo, who was now sitting perfectly still, his eyes glazed and staring at the elevator doors. The distinction between the internal self and the external environment had vanished. Nathan felt his own heart slow down, matching the rhythm of the wind-whipped steel. The morning brought a temporary reprieve as the winds died down, but the scars remained. The streets were littered with the remnants of the night, shattered glass, abandoned cars, and the bodies of animals that had fought until their hearts gave out. The survivors moved like ghosts, their eyes hollow and their movements jerky. They knew the plague was not over. It was merely waiting for the next change in the weather, the next gust of wind to catch the edge of a glass tower and send that invisible agitation through the world. The city was no longer their home. It was a cage of their own making, a place where the air itself had turned against them. Nathan looked at the skyline, no longer seeing a triumph of engineering, but a forest of tuning forks waiting for the conductor to raise his baton. There is a theory in acoustics that every object has a resonant frequency, a specific vibration that can cause it to shatter. We have spent centuries finding the breaking points of glass, of bridges, and of steel. What we failed to consider was the breaking point of the human soul. We have built a world of heights and edges, of narrow passages and vast, echoing halls, never realizing that we were creating a giant instrument. And now, the music has started. It is a low, heavy thrum that vibrates in the chest and whispers to the oldest parts of the brain. It tells us that we are not safe. It tells us that the walls are not protection, but a trap. We are the architects of our own sensory prison. In the aftermath of the Great Resonance, the city began to change. People started to leave the high-rises, moving back to the low-slung suburbs and the open country, where the wind has room to breathe. The skyscrapers stood half empty, their windows reflecting a sky that no longer seemed to belong to the earth. Architectural firms began to study acoustic mitigation, trying to find ways to break the wind, to dampen the agitation, to silence the towers. But the buildings have found their voice, and they will not be silenced easily. Every time the wind rises, the phantom throb returns, a reminder of the thin line between civilization and the primal dark. The structural integrity of our society is now tied to the stability of the air. The problem is not the wind, nor is it the steel. The problem is the geometry. We have created a lattice that filters the natural movement of the world and turns it into a poison for the human nervous system. We are biological relics living in a mechanical dream. The towers do not care for our sleep, and the wind does not care for our sanity. They exist in a world of physics and force, while we struggle to maintain our hold on reality. Nathan eventually left the city, moving to a small house on the plains where the wind only whistles through the grass. But even there, on quiet nights, he sometimes feels his heart skip a beat. He looks toward the horizon where the distant lights of the city flicker, and he remembers the lobby, the circle of neighbors, and the feeling of becoming one with the steel. The shadow people never truly left him. They are the artifacts of a nervous system that has been tuned to a frequency of fear. He knows that across the world, other cities are humming. Other towers are being built, taller and sharper than the ones before. We are expanding our reach, piercing the sky with our ambitions, while the air around us grows heavier and more restless. We are constructing the very instruments that will eventually play our swan song, and we are doing it while calling it progress. The resonance is not an accident. It is a consequence of the heights we demand to reach. As the sun sets over the jagged skyline, the first breeze of a coming storm begins to whistle between the towers. In 1,000 apartments, dogs lift their heads and begin to growl at nothing. In 1,000 bedrooms, people feel a sudden, sharp spike in their heart rate. They look at the corners of their rooms, watching for the smudge of a shadow that should not be there. They check the locks, though they know the pressure comes from within the walls themselves. The city is beginning to wake up, and its voice is a low, heavy thrum that promises no rest. The predator is standing tall, silent, and patient. The wind is rising, and the music is about to begin. Nathan sits on his porch hundreds of miles away, but his fingers still twitch in that familiar rhythmic pattern. He can feel it across the distance, the collective heartbeat of millions of people accelerating as the pressure drops. He knows that for those left behind, the walls are beginning to breathe again. The glass will soon start to sing, and the shadow people will step out of the periphery and into the light. It is a haunting that requires no ghosts, only the movement of air against the hubris of man. The metropolitan dream is vibrating, and eventually, every frequency finds its breaking point. The storm is no longer just a weather event. It is a summons to the primal dark that lives beneath the skin of the modern world.